Então, bom dia a todos. Good morning. So today we're going to talk about sustainability agreements. This is a very hot topic in Europe, but it should become more hot here in Brazil too, and the US we expect. Recently, an European friend told me that everyone in Europe now, I mean the young generation, they don't want to take airplanes anymore. They're refusing to take airplanes. My young son and other like throw trash into the river. So we have this new generation, which is like all the time pushing us to think about that. And business is seeing that and is exponentially backing the global green ambition as society becomes more stringent about sustainability goals, given the growing climate and biodiversity crisis and the growing social and public health challenge. Indeed, without sustainability, how could we fashion growth for the current generation and the ones to follow? Aware of this challenge, players, including competitors, are increasingly considering joining forces in pursuit of these sustainability goals, as promoting sustainable goals independently could potentially mean greater cost for them than for their rivals. In this context, the intersection between sustainability policy and competition policy has gained a new spotlight focused on sustainability agreements. Cooperation agreement between business for the attainment of sustainability goals. In March 2002, the European Commission launched a public consultation on the new draft revised rules on cooperation agreements between competitors, including specific rules on the assessment of sustainability agreements and directions on how companies must self-assess compliance with competition law. However, while any collaboration between business, particularly competitors, require careful management of risks to avoid antitrust infringements, competition authorities are still grappling with some key questions on how to assess such arrangements. For example, what are the goals embraced by sustainability? How should we identify the benefits to consumers, which makes any risk assessment really challenging? Essentially, the role of competition law regarding sustainability agreements raises the following questions. How to ensure that competition policy does not create an unnecessary obstacle to sustainable development? To what extent do sustainable benefits justify agreements which otherwise restrict competition? Is there a thin line between illegal collusion or pro-competitive collaboration? To talk about this very interesting topic, we have here today a great panel. I'm going to start introducing the first two who are going to address the first questions. We're going to have different questions which are going to be addressed by two of them. So here on my left, I have Maria Cecilia. Maria Cecilia has a master's degree in business law from the Coimbra University Law School, Portugal. Postgraduate degree in law applied to economics and business from FGV São Paulo. Specialization program on sustainable capitalism and ESG from University of Berkeley, California. She's an external advisor to the FGV Ethics, and she's the director of compliance at EBROG. She was elected as one of the most globally admired professionals in the field of compliance. We also have here online Michael, who's going to also address the first question. Michael Jurgen Werner is a partner at a Norton Rose Fulbright in the areas of antitrust and competition law in Brussels. He specializes in German and European competition law and regulatory law. He has extensive experience in the most diverse sectors, such as infrastructure, transport, telecommunication, advising both companies and public bodies in international affairs. Yet, in addition, he is a university professor and a regular speaker at international conferences on competition and regulation, as well as a member of the advisory board of the Academy of European Law. And before I actually start the questions, I would like to thank both Ricardo Botelho and Maíra Rodrigues, who supported us in this panel. So let's start with you, Maria Cecilia. What type of agreements fall into sustainability category? Is this purely about environmental goals, or does it include social and ethical ones, such as agreements against child labor?
First, I would like to say good morning to everyone. Initially, I would like also to thank to Denise, Junqueira, and Maíra, Isabel, Saldanha for the invitation for this panel. Last year, it was the first time that IBRAC's annual conference discussed the relation between sustainability and antitrust, and it's an honor to me to be discussing and developing the topic again. I also would like to welcome my colleagues in this panel, Daniel, Michael, and Commissioner Sergio. So, addressing your question, from the antitrust point of view, sustainability agreements in their majority are those involving sustainability principles, especially those that seek savings in energy consumption, gas emissions, recycling, among other objectives. Or in other words, so far, until this moment, this classification is connected to these principles. Issues like child labor, slave labor, discrimination, diversity may also permeate this agreement, but so far they are not considered directly in the antitrust analysis. However, it's possible that this topic should soon appear on the antitrust agenda because the social and ethical principles has also entered in the DG competition agenda. And as a coincidence, exactly today, at this moment, October 27, in Brussels, Margarete Vestager is holding Making Markets Work for People, a full-day conference that will review and debate the impact of competition policy on people's lives. In the view of DG competition, competition policy also has an important social dimension. It creates a fair distribution of new opportunities while keeping prices low. In a nutshell, it makes markets work for people, not the other way around. This forum aims to discuss from different angles the quick question of how we can make markets work for people. In the same way, yesterday, in the opening of this conference, Bill Kovacic mentioned the opinion of Commissioner Slaughter. She wants to make antitrust enforcement anti-racist. I was curious, and I started to understand her opinion yesterday evening. And I read an interview that she gave for CNBC. In her words, I want to be working to promote equity rather than reinforce inequity. And I think doing that is consistent with the FTC's mission and mandate. And doing it in a more clear-eyed way is an important step that we can take. So, just to finish my first comment in this panel, I cannot prove how and when these actions will be fully implemented, but this is a topic that is on the table right now.
Thank you very much, Maria Cecilia. Michael, could you also please address this question for us from a European perspective?
Bom dia, and thank you very much for this wonderful invitation, and many thanks to having the chance to participate. Maria has taken already quite a big chunk of the elements of the discussion. There are two things to say. First of all, indeed, sustainability goes far beyond than only environmental issues. I think the original goes maybe back to 2012, the UN resolution on sustainability, which is really encompassing practically all the different sectors, as Maria said. I mean, have we got a relationship to people and people's life? When we talk about the practice, however, I think by far and almost in the current eye is mainly environmental issue, and that's also the big let's say exchange of ideas, how that can what kind of impact we have got. And if we look in the environmental sphere on the different types of agreements or potential agreements, you could think about, first of all, a kind of standard setting. So wherever there is a standard and where let's say the legislation is not complete, so where industry is more setting standards with a very environmental important issue. The second very important part is sending, let's say, targets. I mean, we know the target issue from the Paris Agreement, where the member states of the Paris Agreement are trying to fulfill certain standards or have set targets. We know it also from COP, from the different COP 26, 27 now. Setting target is a very important issue, and this is now broken down on the private or commercial level, where potential competitors are also trying setting targets. For instance, when to stop a certain technology, when do you stop certain use of fossil products, and so on. And then last but not least, you can also put certain agreements also with regard to potential new products, developing of new products as such, where you really take an active stand, where competitors come together and have an influence on the development, research and development. And then last but not least, from the competition side, we always think about a very important issue with regard to sustainability is, of course, the exchange of information. The exchange of information and also the signaling, potentially where certain competitors make statements going into the market, and that has an impact also then on, let's say, other competitors or potential competitors in order to have got an effect on how they act on the market. So if we take this, I mean, these are the classical competition law agreements we all know, which are subject to competition law in principle, which you find also to a certain degree under the sustainability agreement. So this is probably in a nutshell, as I may see it, and open to discussion. So you have got a very broad, probably not yet completely defined issue of what sustainability is covering at all. And if you break it down, there might be 4 or 5 types of different type of agreements, which we know also from other areas of competition law, which come back also under the in the gown of a sustainability agreement. So I think it's finding the way here what has been covered, but it's a relatively broad issue, and you cannot restrict it only to a very narrow issue.
That's very interesting. Thank you. I'm going to introduce now the 2 other panelists who are going to address the following questions. I have here on my right Commissioner Sergio, who by itself would not need the introduction, but so Commissioner Sergio was graduating law from University of Brasilia, specialization in public law from PUC Rio Grande do Sul, and in public management and administration from Fundação Getúlio Vargas. Has been a prosecutor for the National Treasury since 2008, having held the position of Chief Prosecutor of the Special Monitoring Division at the Regional Prosecutor's Office for the National Treasury of the First Region. He was a deputy chief for the legal affairs of General Secretariat of the Presidency between 2016 and 2019. He was a board member of the company BB Dental between 2017 and 2019. And we have online Daniel Bitton. Daniel has an LLM from NYU in antitrust and is a partner at Axinn. He's trained in the EU and the US, and he navigates Fortune 500 clients through antitrust litigation, government investigations, and merger clearance process across the globe. Thank you for being here today with us. Let's start with Sergio. What are the main concerns arising from the sustainability agreements, and how can we mitigate the concerns?
Thank you, Denise. Good morning, everyone present here today. Before I start, I'd like to thank BRAC for the invite, and also would like to congratulate Denise for choosing such paramount and modern topic, which we are all still becoming familiar with. I would also like to say that it's a pleasure and honor to be sharing this panel with renowned and experienced lawyers. Broadening knowledge and exchanging experiences are crucial for understanding sustainability agreements from an antitrust perspective. As I agree with Michael and Daniel prior to today's meeting, I'll be answering the questions in Portuguese. Obrigado pela pergunta, Denise. Em determinadas circunstâncias, a cooperação entre empresas pode gerar benefícios relevantes e estabelecer melhores condições para que os agentes econômicos atendam metas de sustentabilidade. Por outro lado, a coordenação de ações empresariais suscita preocupações concorrenciais na medida em que tende a neutralizar ou mitigar níveis de concorrência entre os participantes do acordo e do mercado, além de facilitar a prática de condutas colusivas. Em razão dos efeitos ambíguos produzidos, esses arranjos costumam ser analisados segundo a regra da razão. Em geral, a licitude desses acordos sob a perspectiva concorrencial depende da forma com que os acordos de cooperação são estruturados, em especial quanto ao escopo, duração e extensão geográfica estabelecidos, da parcela de mercado afetada pelo acordo, assim como pelas salvaguardas adotadas para mitigar as preocupações concorrenciais envolvidas. Assim, alguns pontos de atenção devem ser observados pelas empresas na estruturação de seus acordos de sustentabilidade, ressaltando que sempre devem ser considerados no âmbito do contexto e particularidades de cada caso concreto. A primeira preocupação seria a delimitação imprecisa do acordo para atingir as metas de sustentabilidade estabelecidas. Sustainability Agreements são acordos de colaboração entre empresas, incluindo iniciativas setoriais da indústria e de associações comerciais, com o intuito de atingir metas de sustentabilidade, a partir de propostas de melhorias de produção, distribuição e desenvolvimento de novas tecnologias. Para que esses acordos sejam compatíveis com a legislação concorrencial, é importante que as partes envolvidas esclareçam de maneira objetiva o escopo, a duração e a extensão territorial adotados para a implementação das estratégias definidas. É recomendado que a estratégia de colaboração adotada deva ser específica e direcionada para tratar de um problema delimitado que tenha por fundamento o atendimento de metas de sustentabilidade, e indicar os benefícios e os beneficiários que se pretendem alcançar, e não abranger meios mais amplos do que os necessários para se viabilizar os resultados pretendidos, a exemplo do alcance dos benefícios desejados pelas empresas de forma independente. Detalhar como e em que intervalo temporal as metas delimitadas pelo acordo devem ser atingidas, incluindo a previsão de prazos para revisão ou avaliação periódica das medidas adotadas, quando aplicável. Delimitar o território geográfico em que a estratégia será implementada, adotando o cuidado de justificar a extensão definida com os objetivos de sustentabilidade almejados, e demonstrar um comparativo de cenário proposto com cooperação em relação aos cenários contrafactuais sem cooperação. Uma segunda preocupação seria com a imposição de determinações excessivamente restritivas. É comum que a estruturação dos Sustainability Agreements envolva o estabelecimento de standards, a exemplo de padrões mínimos de qualidade ou indicadores de sustentabilidade sobre aspectos de produtos, insumos e do processo produtivo das empresas participantes, que podem ser implementados por meio de associações comerciais ou organizações de padronização. Os participantes devem se atentar para implementar critérios de participação transparentes, razoáveis e não discriminatórios, que condicionem o cumprimento de tais padronizações a imposições excessivamente restritivas, resultando na exclusão de concorrentes e aumento de barreiras à entrada para ingresso de novas empresas, a partir da criação de dificuldades artificiais ou mecanismos de punição para participantes que não se adequem ao estándar do acordo. Outra preocupação é com a utilização da padronização como instrumento que facilita a coordenação entre os participantes. Exemplo disso pode ser encontrado na jurisprudência europeia, no caso do cartel dos detergentes para consumidores. Nesse caso específico, os 3 membros do conluio impuseram uma medida voltada a impedir que qualquer um dos participantes utilizasse suas iniciativas ambientais como forma de promover seus produtos no mercado. Assim, o uso promocional das iniciativas ambientais dos detergentes foi proibido, de modo a preservar as posições de mercado dos participantes do acordo e aumentar preços desses produtos. Assim, é recomendado que os Sustainability Agreements sejam restritivos apenas no limite estritamente necessário para alcance dos objetivos estabelecidos no acordo, além de explicitar a racionalidade que fundamenta os padrões exigidos dos participantes e a adequação dos meios cooperativos utilizados com os objetivos que se pretendem alcançar, especialmente na existência de alternativas menos restritivas à concorrência, como o alcance dos benefícios de sustentabilidade desejados de maneira independente. No contexto de acordos de padronização mais amplos de setores industriais com impactos concorrenciais, pode ser recomendado que a autoridade concorrencial participe dos estágios iniciais do processo de padronização, dialogando com os agentes privados e o governo a respeito dos riscos concorrenciais envolvidos e garantindo que as discussões entre os participantes sejam limitadas ao necessário para que os objetivos de sustentabilidade almejados sejam alcançados. Por último, uma terceira preocupação seria com o compartilhamento de informações sensíveis entre empresas. Outra preocupação sobre os Sustainability Agreements diz respeito ao risco de compartilhamento de informações concorrencialmente sensíveis entre os participantes do acordo. Informações que não sejam estritamente necessárias para o cumprimento dos objetivos sustentáveis almejados e que possam alterar os incentivos e comportamento econômico das empresas em direção à menor competição no mercado, devem ser objeto de cautela, preocupação e diligência dos envolvidos, que devem adotar medidas de governança corporativa e compliance, destinados a preservar a concorrência entre os participantes do acordo e mitigar os riscos concorrenciais envolvidos. Algumas autoridades, a exemplo da CMA, a Autoridade Concorrencial do Reino Unido, apontam como medidas para mitigar tais riscos concorrenciais a adoção de Chinese Walls, a intervenção de um terceiro independente, a exemplo de uma associação comercial ou consultoria de inteligência de mercado, que possa intermediar a coleta e o tratamento de dados dos membros participantes, permitindo sua disponibilização de forma agregada e anonimizada, acompanhadas das justificativas pela necessidade desse compartilhamento para o cumprimento dos objetivos sustentáveis estabelecidos. Os terceiros independentes contratados devem assumir compromissos e cuidados para não compartilhar informações individualizadas recebidas com as empresas e não atuar de forma a facilitar a coordenação entre os participantes.
That's also very interesting. I'm going to invite now Daniel to add on that from a U.S. perspective. Thank you, Daniel.
Thanks, Denise, for arranging all of this, and thank you to my fellow panelists for inviting me and speaking with me on this panel. It's an honor. Jurgen and I entered a sustainability agreement and both agreed not to use the fossil fuel to fly over to Brazil and stay in our respective jurisdictions. Of course, that detracts a little bit from the quality of the panel here, but we figured it's a sacrifice on quality of the panel in favor of some environmental objectives. In all seriousness, though, it is obviously a very important topic. I remember opening a conference during the pandemic when there were raging wildfires. I'm here in California around us and thinking, boy, what are we all doing here, noodling over technical antitrust topics while the world is on fire? We should be all putting our collective intellectual firepower behind more important problems. So I think this is actually refreshing, where we can talk about these really important problems, but in the context of antitrust and combine that. So again, really, really important topic, and thanks for inviting me to speak on that. The question put to us, or at least the one at issue now, is what are the main concerns arising from, say, sustainability agreements and how to mitigate them? I think the main concerns are the core concerns of antitrust, the most significant ones, according to many still, even though there is currently a lot of focus on dominance issues across the world. I think we can all still agree that cartels are considered, at least in the United States, the supreme evil of antitrust. And that is, I think, the concern here is that in the spirit of trying to achieve environmental improvement or other ESG objectives, that competitors get together and effectively strike agreements that are cartel agreements. A agreement to, the simplest form would be, let's all agree to just charge 20% more for products that are harmful to the environment. That's sort of almost like collectively imposing a tax, and that's certainly outside the antitrust world, if the governments do that, a legitimate way to disincentivize use of products that harm the environment. And so it has that objective, but it's also a price fixing agreement. So I think those are some of the main concerns. Obviously, that's an extreme example, but there are, and as a counselor, regularly scenarios where a client comes to you and says, really, I want to move to more environmentally friendly products and manufacturing them or selling them, but that's a lot more costly. Their price is going to be higher. And if I'm the only one doing it and my competitors continue to offer lower cost, less environmentally friendly products, I'm going to lose my market share or something like that. So I need everybody to get on board. And that is a very understandable issue. But you still sort of pretty quickly get into, let's all agree to just get rid of or stop producing the lower cost products in favor of the higher cost products because they're environmentally more friendly. And so I think those are the core concerns. And I do think it's often that concern by a company and a client that if they're the only ones doing it, they're going to suffer competitively. But I do think that sort of goes to the heart of the concerns as well. And so that's to briefly address what are the main concerns arising out of these agreements. I think those are sort of somewhat obvious, but true issues that come up in these sustainability agreement contexts. And then how to mitigate them. I think that's the big problem and challenge that we're all trying to think about more. And I would say certain European jurisdictions are well ahead in that effort and the agencies there than we are in the US in terms of developing clarity and predictability around that. So in the US, there are no guidelines, but the Dutch Competition Authority, the ACM, is particularly forward-looking in that and has published drafts of guidelines around this. But in the US, we don't have that at all. And I think in the US, there's actually somewhat more skepticism around ESG being a basis for justifying agreements that otherwise would restrict competition. And there's, I think, at a high level in the US, more the idea of competition is going to solve this. People come up with better products, economically friendly products, electronic vehicles, and they compete, and competition is going to drive that. But that said, obviously, not every agreement is unlawful, and so I think mitigations that, from a U.S. perspective, you can think of is doing something less than agreeing with your competitors to produce more or less of a certain type of product, but rather through an industry association, for example, and I'll throw out a few examples that are sort of safer ways to go from a U.S. perspective, is working on best practices on sourcing more environmentally friendly or producing more environmentally friendly, developing standards or labels, industry accepted labels that people can certify under to show that their products are more environmentally friendly. Obviously, you need to think there about making sure you don't get entangled in a group boycott situation where you deny somebody certification that's a competitor of yours on grounds that are not very objective and clear. So when you have a standard developed and certification processes as an industry association, you want to be very careful that those are very transparent and objectively applied. Codes of conduct that are not binding and voluntary are also other ways to sort of make commitments. For example, a commitment as an industry without it being binding, but to strive to reduce 40% of your plastic packaging use or something like that, without exactly spelling out how exactly each participant or competitor is going to do that. And so there was recently the Net Zero Alliance, there was an article on this. It's an alliance among insurance companies, and they initially wanted to just all agree no longer to do coal insurance. And at the advice of counsel, I think this was all made public. They instead sort of made an overarching commitment to reach net zero emissions from their insurance and reinsurance underwriting portfolios by a certain year, but without spelling out how each member would do that, so that you continue to have competition effectively among the members to achieve a certain goal. So there are sort of ways to take the risk out and get to agreements or codes of conduct or standards that are more flexible and don't spell out what each competitor is going to do, so that you leave the process. It's a very American way of thinking. You should leave the competitive process to actually ultimately achieving those goals, and preserve as much independence of each competitor as to how they're going to achieve these things. But I appreciate that those are pretty loose commitments, and so query whether you're going to be able to achieve government imposed objectives for a country or even a continent to achieve certain environmental goals. And so I think other ways to do it that entail somewhat more risk, but still should be as we call it in the US, a rule of reason analysis rather than a per se violation, is to form a joint venture, but do so with some of your competitors. And there are in the US, at least under government guidelines, some safe harbors for collaborations with that account for less than a combined 20% market share. And have a true venture that legitimately tries to achieve, for example, collective sourcing, so that you can benefit from greater volume discounts, sourcing collectively of more environmentally friendly raw materials at a better price, or jointly with a competitor, jointly developing new, more competitively friendly products. And there's also examples of scenarios where the DOJ review, this is old though, from '92, so that it tells you how little recent guidance there is from the agencies in the US. But the one example from the early '90s was where DOJ reviewed a collective effort by utilities to make a fund available for refrigerator manufacturers to produce more environmentally friendly refrigerators that use less electricity. Each of the utilities had an interest in that because the consumer refrigerators were collectively sucking up a lot of electricity, and so they created a fund basically to sponsor that and incentivize production of such more environmentally friendly refrigerators, and they basically put it out for bid to see who could do the best job at that. So there are all kinds of ways to get at this that entail less risk, and avoid sort of characterization of per se cartel violation type conduct.
Great, thank you. That's very interesting. It seems like everyone agrees that we should definitely be pushing more into these agreements, and there are ways, to address all the concerns, but we definitely need to address what the younger generation wants. And here in Brazil, we actually have that too in the refrigerators and all electricity, actually, where they will sign that it's more environmental friendly. Our next question, it's actually related to that. What consumer benefits and or efficiencies could potentially outweigh competition concerns in sustainability agreements, and how broad the concept of consumer can be? Michael, could you start addressing that one?
I think we're living also in competition law in a bit of a revolutionary time, and I fully appreciate what was said before, but we have to see, and Denise, you made it clear, politically speaking, competition law is going into probably a new era. And this era is to drive away from our current system, I think all over the world, which is legal, commercial aspects, economical aspects, to probably also political aspects. And that is a clear point here for consumer benefits. And what does it mean? I mean, under now, I think we have got a certain agreement that benefits will always be evaluated from a commercial individual point of view. What kind of positive effect is brought to the individual when you agree on a certain kind of collaboration type. We have two new elements now, and this is the non-commercial benefit on the one hand side, and in addition, which is even broader, the collective benefit. So you cannot identify anymore, if you go to the different types of agreements, what is the individual benefit for the individual consumer, other than, for instance, in the case, for instance, on refrigerators, where you could say, well, you get a better product. Also, the one consumer who is maybe suffering of a kind of narrowing down the quality ones, but you get a better product individually. When you think about, and then you mentioned the fire in California, or the sufferings of flood in other parts of the world, which is definitely a kind of benefit if we can reduce this as a mankind, from a mankind point of view. But even if Europe is doing a certain collaboration, that might have an effect in South America, in Asia, in Africa, it's definitely a collective benefit, but it's not an individual benefit of the consumer. And actually, that's the revolutionary point, which I would call it in competition law, to change this and to accept that also this kind of collective benefits, which are not immediately felt by the individual consumer in the jurisdiction where the collaboration takes part, is taken into account. And then you mentioned also the Dutch authority, ACM, which has clearly spelled out that that would be acceptable from their point of view. And this is indeed the point now of probably major discussion, and I would say globally. Could we accept this? And when you think about it, the Chinese jurisdiction, Public Republic, have got in their competition law already a kind of referral to environmental issues. It has been never tested yet, but there is indeed a referral. You could argue, yes, it might be that also a collective benefit would be under the Chinese competition law a potential issue. But how is this with those competition laws where we do not have a specific referral? Do we accept this? And I agree with Denise. I think the pressing from the general politics side, and as I made also clear by the EU Commission from the EU, that there will be more effects coming from the general ideas, the general benefits have got a spillover effect of competition law, will be a going trend. But however, and I here in full consent also with surgery, it cannot be used too lightheartedly. You need to have a connection. You need to have a kind of whatever you have agreed on as competitors. You need to have a connection with the overall collective benefit goals. You have to demonstrate that what you are doing might really got this kind of collective benefit. So first of all, the competition authorities, which I personally believe will be the trend, will accept also collective benefit issues, not only individual consumer issues. But on the other side of the equation, then also the private side has to clearly demonstrate where are the benefits specifically from the collective point of view. So there needs to be a connection. So change or further or broader interpretation of what we have currently got into competition law to a collective benefit or non-commercial benefit aspect as well. But on the other hand, you need to have a kind of relatively close look with regard of the connectivity as such. Is there a kind of connectivity? Might there have been scientific-based issues which more or less demonstrate that you could receive a kind of collective benefit in future, especially also when it's in other parts of the world. So I think this is a very difficult topic. I think we all would probably agree it should be somehow the legislator to give the more clear guidance here. But as long as the legislator is doing that, and for a lot of or myriads of reasons, legislators are not going in this sphere, so probably it's good so, because it might also harm competition in the future. I think the private side has to build a bridge here why a collective benefit is possible. And probably we can take one kind of analogy where we have got this revolution already taken place, and that's, at least if you say it from the EU perspective, on the public procurement side. 6, 7, 8 years ago, it was quite the outrage to take elements into your public procurement concern which have been outside commercial issues. Nowadays, it is accepted. You can put in criteria from the public procurement side to evaluate trademarks or certain labels which guarantee you a minimum criteria. I'm not saying that we should take this development into account also on the side of pure competition law, but however, it might give us a kind of thinking, reasoning, how we can use this kind for proof that, for instance, collective benefit is the outcome and how you can tempt it. I don't think that we have yet the final formula to that. There will be still a lot of discussion as to go on. We need concrete examples. For instance, the one Daniel mentioned on the washing machine side and the labeling there. But we can also imagine other ones, especially if there's a political trend and scientific trend to more or less unilaterally coming to the conclusion that a certain behavior is wrong, so we have to change it. That could be, for instance, an issue also to bring that into our collective benefit discussion. So it is a bit of a kind of new situation on competition law. It will be more difficult. It will be more fact-based. It will be also more put the proof side on the private side to get into showing and demonstrating what is positive. But I personally believe it's inevitable because the demands from the political side are very strong. And I think the facts we're seeing around the world on climate change, for instance, but also in all the other aspects we mentioned on the sustainability are so severe that we have to deal with this also from a competition side. I think we cannot rule out that there will be collaborations among potentials and actual competitors, but to see the gray line here, to develop this and to prove this with the kind of benefits discussion, I think we need to have.
Thank you very much. Maria Cecilia, could you add, please, from a Brazilian perspective?
Yes, and I think I'm going to complement things that Jurgen said, because it was a very complete explanation. But so the benefits for the consumer, this is the debate of the moment. What would be effective benefits when you consider sustainability in the antitrust analysis, allowing cooperation between competitors? As Jurgen said, and as Commissioner said, this cooperation must be carefully reviewed in order to avoid any anti-competitive risks, and this could occur with the establishment of clear and objective governance rules about what was already said, the limits of the cooperation, the period of the agreement, the roles of each company in this cooperation, and whenever possible, the results that are intended to be achieved properly quantified, because I think this is the big discussion when we are discussing efficiency in applying sustainability for agreements. And also, in my point of view, transparency and accountability to the players and also to the authorities and consumers. They should, this is two criteria that must be observed. And when you start to review the discussions, the debate is centered on issues of better technologies, innovation, product quality, not necessarily focused on prices. And another thing that when we see this discussion in the market is that agreements result in investments, creating good markets, green markets, with the best use of energy, recycling, water use, diverse economy, reduction of emissions, and etc. In other words, I believe that more sustainability means more efficiency. So this is something that should be observed. With regard to the consumer, we know that in the first moment, and Daniel said and Jurgen said, these products will not always reach all the consumer in a broad way, so these new products or the new savings, but the tendency is that the more sustainability principles are used in this kind of agreement, and in the long term, this is not a short-term review, they will certainly no longer be the exception, which may result in better prices and, I believe, a wider reach of consumers. So at the first moment, you will probably have products that are not so available for all the consumers, but in the long term, they will be. In fact, what we have observed in the ESG agenda, without talking specifically about antitrust, the discussions began in the financial market with the aim of mitigating risks. And it started very slowly, and today the large companies do not escape to prepare for the ESG journey under the risk of being passed over in the decision of new investments. So I believe that this is the same that will occur here. We do not need to put this, the sustainability as a first criteria, as a thing that should be in all agreements, but I believe that in the long term, will be something that will be normal, not the exception anymore.
Thank you. The next one is the 1 million question. I'm going to start with Sergio. How do we differentiate horizontal cooperation agreements that generally pursue one or more sustainability objectives from the ones using sustainability as a cover for anti-competitive practice?
Obrigado, Denise. Temos que atualizar apenas aí a moeda de valor. $1 milhão hoje em dia talvez já não seja mais o caso. Talvez 1 milhão de bitcoins seja um valor mais aproximado.
That's a good point.
E sim, é uma pergunta muito interessante que deve ser endereçada também pela autoridade com o máximo de critério e objetividade possível. O comprometimento com objetivos sustentáveis não constitui uma isenção concorrencial para o cometimento de ilícitos anticompetitivos, existindo preocupações quanto ao uso indevido da pauta de sustentabilidade, utilizando-se de práticas ambientais enganosas para encobrir condutas anticompetitivas, o chamado greenwashing. Em razão das preocupações concorrenciais decorrentes da cooperação entre empresas, é importante que os participantes do acordo se atentem em justificar a necessidade, a racionalidade, os benefícios e os limites da coordenação pretendida, demonstrando que os resultados almejados não poderiam ser alcançados de maneira viável por meios menos restritivos à concorrência. As diligências adotadas na estruturação dos acordos antes de sua implementação, nessa esteira, costumam ser evidências consistentes de que os acordos de cooperação perseguem objetivos sustentáveis genuínos. É recomendado que as empresas apresentem provas documentais internas dessas diligências e cuidados adotados, de maneira a demonstrar a boa-fé na estruturação dos acordos, a exemplo de e-mails e relatórios elaborados por firmas de advocacia e consultorias empresariais que trabalharam na estruturação desses acordos. O ônus de demonstrar a indispensabilidade da cooperação recai sobre as partes proponentes do acordo, bem como a comprovação dos benefícios que serão gerados. A competição não deve ser vista como um obstáculo à sustentabilidade, pelo contrário. Muitas inovações técnicas voltadas à maior sustentabilidade são desenvolvidas e utilizadas como vantagens competitivas para a conquista de novos consumidores e aumento de market share. Assim, é importante avaliar eventuais inadequações estabelecidas nos acordos de cooperação horizontal. Existem 3 importantes indicadores que apontam para essas inadequações. O primeiro indicador seria o compartilhamento indiscriminado de informações comercialmente sensíveis, que não contemplam explicações sobre a relevância, ambiental ou não, da extensão do compartilhamento para a concretização dos objetivos do acordo. É importante que as justificativas sejam compatíveis com os motivos, o escopo e a técnica de compartilhamento explicitada nos acordos. Outro indicador é a presença de restrições excessivas e injustificadas nos acordos de cooperação horizontal. A exigência dessas limitações podem envolver estratégias anticompetitivas que têm como objetivo excluir, dificultar ou impedir a entrada de novas empresas no mercado ou facilitar a colusão entre os participantes. Exemplos disso incluem a imposição de obrigações artificiais e desnecessárias, relacionadas à adoção de standards sem demonstração de necessidade para alcançar as metas de sustentabilidade almejadas. Outra estratégia anticompetitiva que pode se materializar é a criação de normas excludentes voltadas a prevenir a entrada de novas tecnologias ou de rivais no mercado. E um terceiro indicador que eu gostaria de apontar seria a ausência de racionalidade econômica e a existência de meios menos restritivos à concorrência para alcançar os benefícios pretendidos. Acordos que não apresentam racionalidade econômica clara e que adotem mecanismos restritivos à concorrência sem justificar sua imprescindibilidade para alcance dos benefícios pretendidos, especialmente diante de alternativas viáveis menos restritivas, e quando se trata da cobertura de parcela substancial de mercado afetada, suscitam preocupações concorrenciais que podem apontar para a existência de efeitos anticompetitivos. As condutas anticompetitivas que tenham por objeto fixar preços, dividir mercados e uniformizar práticas comerciais permanecem sendo alvo de grande preocupação concorrencial. Exemplo recente é o caso do cartel das emissões de carros analisado pela Comissão Europeia, no qual funcionários de 3 grupos concorrentes distintos mantinham encontros regulares para debater questões relacionadas ao desenvolvimento de tecnologias de filtragem de óxido de nitrogênio em carros movidos a diesel e acordaram em atrasar o avanço e implementação de tais tecnologias no mercado.
Thank you. That's actually very interesting, and I can see the parallel, with the CAGIS case law. So it would be interesting now to understand from Daniel the U.S. perspective.
Well, so the question is how to differentiate horizontal cooperation agreements that genuinely pursue one or more ESG objectives from the ones that use ESG issues as a cover for anti-competitive practices. I think that the assumption in that question may be a little off, or at least from a U.S. perspective. I think that the trouble is that I think a lot of these agreements genuinely are meant to address ESG issues, but at the same time also genuinely try to do so in a way potentially that is just restricting competition, right? So I don't think it's necessarily a contrast of you have agreements that are perfectly legitimate and then the ones that are pretending to be legitimate but are not. I think that's sort of a false contrast in some ways. And I think the U.S. approach just is a bit different, and sort of harking back to what Jurgen said, is sort of you have these scenarios where you're basically concede that you're trying to solve a market externality problem that normally you want a legislative body to solve, right? That's the issue. It's almost in some instances is we think competition actually drives us to a bad result. And it goes back to the example I said that you regularly have clients come to you and say, hey, I want to produce more environmentally friendly products, but they're more expensive. And if I do it alone, then others are going to basically compete with me and I'm going to lose out in the market. So I don't want to do it. So it's sort of saying competition is not going to lead. I'm not going to do it if I have to compete. And so I think, as Jurgen said, there is sort of this, and you see that in the draft guidelines for the ACM in the Netherlands, which I think are excellent work product, but they do concede there are these agreements that restrict competition and have these benefits, and now we're going to have to weigh which one is more important or more significant. In the US, I have a very hard time seeing the government agencies ever wanting to do that because they don't feel that that's their job. And so to illustrate that recently, because these topics have come up recently in the US and including in politics. And so a senator in the US asked the chair of the FTC, Chair Khan, and the Assistant Attorney General, Jonathan Cantor, at the Department of Justice, a question in a recent Senate hearing about this, saying, in the context, he posed the question in the context of antitrust implications of collective net zero commitments, whereby companies pledge to limit fossil fuel production and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And he asked whether collusion to restrict supply is generally unlawful and whether antitrust laws include an exemption for ESG initiatives. Now, obviously, that's putting it in a way that's very extreme, but it also put Chair Khan and Assistant Attorney General Cantor in the position to basically say there is no exemption for ESG issues, and the FTC has seen firms come to us and try to claim ESG exemption, and we have to explain to them clearly that there is no such thing. And Cantor similarly sort of answered, when firms have substantial power and they use that power to achieve any competitive ends, that should be actionable under antitrust laws. That's obviously a very diplomatic and generic answer. But what they were saying is, and often these sustainability agreements get to sort of, we all agree that we're going to produce less of this product that's not environmentally friendly and more of this product that is environmentally more friendly. And that effectively is agreeing to restrict output of something. And an agreement to restrict output, generally, and certainly plaintiffs' lawyers in the United States, and obviously you have lots of litigation here. That's the other thing. You can get certainty maybe in guidelines from the government, but private plaintiff lawyers don't care about that. And so it's also, what risk do you run in the US from private treble damages lawsuits? And private plaintiff lawyers will pretty easily can characterize that. Yeah, you have an agreement among competitors to restrict output. That's a cartel agreement. And you can then they say, and so you don't balance it against anything because it's per se unlawful. And so I think in the US, the sort of balancing the good ESG results against some restriction of competition is a harder sell, I would say, generally speaking, unless you can show this really falls outside of the per se category. And so you have to frame it as something other than that you're going to agree to restrict the output or agree to certain price components, because you could very quickly get close to sort of cartel like conduct. And I think the recent statements from the agencies, even though these are very progressive, very aggressive antitrust agencies at the moment, they still are sort of veering away from that. Another recent example in the US that's kind of interesting, that's from the prior administration, where the Assistant Attorney General and the Department of Justice started investigating commitments by Honda, Volkswagen, Ford, and BMW in California to achieve the stricter environmental and car emission norms that the state of California had put out, which were stricter than what the Trump administration had put out under the federal regulations. And so this was a political issue because the federal government didn't like that California set even more ambitious goals. So the Department of Justice started investigating whether Honda, Volkswagen, Ford, and BMW had collaborated amongst themselves to figure out how to comply with the stricter California car emission norms. And that was and then it turned out that no, in fact, each of these car manufacturers had just individual agreements with the state of California and no horizontal agreement among them. But it illustrates that immediately the government started investigating that as a potential antitrust violation, even though it was in order to try to comply with government car emission norms. Again, this was it was cast as a political job at the insistence of the White House that the DOJ initiated the investigation. The DOJ dropped the investigation. They didn't issue a public statement about it, but the Assistant Attorney General did later on write an op-ed piece saying, the loftiest purpose, the loftiest of purported motivations do not excuse any competitive collusion among rivals, which is to say, you may have great ESG objectives and they may all be legitimate, but it does not justify entering an agreement that among competitors that restricts competition. And so that is a little bit of the approach and view in the US. Now, again, there are ways to, as I discussed earlier, to have agreements that are less binding by competitors or agreements around things that are not price or output or customer allocation or things that could be characterized as such. But I do think basically taking the place of government and saying these ESG objectives are so important and the value of them is much greater than the little bit of price competition that we eliminate. I think that's a hard sell, but that is what I know people are thinking about. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. That actually shows, the challenges which we are facing, which comes to our last question. How can we ensure that competition policy does not act as a barrier to collaboration intended to bring innovation solutions and or improve products and services? Commissioner Sérgio, could you start?
Claro, obrigado.
Thank you.
O diálogo entre a autoridade, agentes privados, reguladores e a academia é imprescindível para permitir o desenvolvimento de um ambiente institucional preparado para responder os diferentes desafios e adaptações exigidas para o equacionamento dos problemas apresentados ao CAD e que sejam compatíveis com a legislação concorrencial. A transparência, completude e precisão das informações apresentadas à autoridade, especialmente sobre as condições do mercado afetado e o contexto em que as iniciativas de colaboração são desenvolvidas, assim como a demonstração das diligências adotadas para a estruturação dos acordos de cooperação, exercem papel fundamental para que o diálogo entre a autoridade e agentes privados possa se desenvolver em direção a um ambiente institucional que apresente segurança jurídica para fomentar soluções inovadoras, ao mesmo tempo em que resguarda a ordem econômica de infrações concorrenciais. Neste sentido, cabe às proponentes de acordos de sustentabilidade empenharem-se para delimitar com clareza os meios utilizados e os objetivos a serem atingidos por tais acordos, com base em informações sobre as metas e mecanismos a serem aplicados e considerando um cuidado adequado sobre a governança de informações concorrencialmente sensíveis, é possível mitigar as preocupações concorrenciais. Importante destacar que, nesse momento, ainda não há evidências suficientes que estabeleçam relação entre, por um lado, eventuais barreiras e obstáculos ao alcance das metas de sustentabilidade e, por outro, a política concorrencial adotada pelo CAD sobre o tema, que justifiquem um tratamento concorrencial diferenciado aos Sustainability Agreements relativamente aos demais acordos de colaboração entre empresas. No Brasil, ainda não há publicação de um guia institucional consolidando o entendimento do CAD sobre acordos de colaboração entre concorrentes, incluindo Sustainability Agreements, podendo ser uma iniciativa futura importante para garantir maior clareza e segurança jurídica sobre esse tema aos administrados. Atualmente, os proponentes de acordos de sustentabilidade podem recorrer ao procedimento de consulta ao Tribunal do CAD para obter salvaguardas quanto à adequação concorrencial dos arranjos voltados para o desenvolvimento sustentável. O CAD tem se mostrado atento às demandas da sociedade e empenha-se a atendê-las no momento oportuno. E aqui lembro o exemplo da publicação da Nota Informativa Temporária sobre colaboração entre empresas para o enfrentamento da crise de Covid-19, elaborada no contexto da pandemia de Covid.
Thank you. Michael, could you add from a European perspective, please?
Yes, many thanks. I think the whole discussion have to show that two things have to be done from my point of view. The first thing is there needs to be a general openness to discuss this issue, and specifically on the side of the authorities, the governments, but also on the side of the industry and private side, and also the consumer. It is a topic which is burning, it is a topic which is highly political, and if you started our discussion like that, people require that things have been done. Even on the highest level, the UN is very much behind this kind of issues, and they are really stimulating stakeholders to participate in agreements and arrangements. But on the other hand, and that's the second point, of course, we cannot throw competition policy and competition law out of the window by using simply ESG terms. So what has to be done, and that's the openness. The second thing is it is an international problem. It is not a problem only of one jurisdiction. In the end of the day, we have, to a certain degree, 193 authorities worldwide to more or less come to the conclusion that something has to be done. There will be certain authorities, like then you mentioned the Dutch and others, they maybe play a front runner, but I mean, they're only a small mosaic peak. There must be a kind of general idea, and it's really, and therefore I'm very, very happy that we have the discussion today. There must be a kind of, let's say, front running by maybe the ones who have been more, the authorities, they have been more, let's say, tempting to go forward, to bring a kind of innovative element into competition law, who sees that as a very, very burning point as well, ESG, to bring it forward. But on the other hand, it's also the private side, the company side, the business model side, who really have to explain what they do. And Maria, you really used the word transparency. There must be transparency on the ESG grounds. There must be a kind of connectivity with the consumer groups and let's say the ones who suffer from the negative outcome if we don't do anything. And that must be pretty clear. There must be this kind of transparency so that the goals have to be, let's say, they can be evaluated by the competition authorities. They can be measured, exactly as you said, Charles. There has to be a measurement, and there's a very clear measurement. It's not just to go wishy-washy about and to do something for greenwashing. No, they have to be really measured. It's a kind of cooperation among the different stakeholders. And last but not least, and I think that's also very, very important to think about that, we need to understand, because competition law is about saving and regarding competition. We can only compete in the world where we really have products with a minimum level of benefit for the consumer and society. And if there's a disparity, then we have to be competition among business models. And I think here the competition authority play a very important role. They have to give the guidance. They have to give the framework. They have to prepare also together with the private side, based on transparency and clear and open rules, what are, maybe not exemptions, but what are the criteria under which a certain element can be justified, yes or no. Because that's an important point for bringing competition further. If everybody is blocked by unclear or not, let's say, bringing forward legal certainty, we get in a situation that businesses are blocked, that competition is blocked. So that's what's all in our hearts, to bring forward competition. We need this kind of framework. So I only can advocate in order to show that competition authorities, and also we all as consumers and being participating in competition, we bring forward competition as well, that we think about how we can build this framework, how we can give guidance, and how we can, let's say, show the both the consumer side, but also the industry side and private side, what they can do. The worst thing is if we get stuck in a year-long debate, discussion, shall we do it, shall we not do it? If at the end of the day, we are stumbling and we are not going forward. It is a very difficult point, but I mean, as we, in the past, we are not doing because it's easy, we're doing because it's difficult, because they are all connected with very difficult decision makings, and we have to give room also from a competition point of view to go forward with this. I think the introduction of competition law, maybe 50, 60 years, I know in the US has been always a front runner, but at least in Europe and then later on in the rest of the world, has been a struggle for many, many countries. Now we are in the next step, how we can open it for the well-being of the society. And I think that's the point now we have all to decide, and we should try to have this open dialogue as we do now, and to speak over the different continents actually, to see what could be a framework to be accepted.
Thank you. Maria Cecilia, do you also agree with that, the importance of transparency and global guidelines?
Yes, I already mentioned, and also the Commissioner Sergio and also Jurgen explained about we need legal security. We are talking, of course, about important goals for this kind of agreements, but a legal framework, guideline, I think it's very important to the discussion. And I believe that if you have more, as I said, more sustainability means more efficiency. And of course, we have to deal with this topic. This is I know that this is a new topic here in Brazil, but this is a topic that is being discussed everywhere. And ICN organized the last meeting with this focus, with a legal report to discuss sustainability in the antitrust analysis. And I believe that we will have, this is the way that the world is moving. And if we start to think about more agreements and more sustainability in the operations that we deal with, not only cooperation agreements between competitors, but even mergers, we'll have better products, innovations, and better technology. And I think that's very aligned with the objective of competition policy. So efficiency, new technology, innovation. So we have all these topics in our competition law here in Brazil and also in several jurisdictions. And another thing that I mentioned, just to conclude, that is a very large demand in the financial market for the implementation of this sustainability criteria in the operations, in the contracts, in the agreements, investments, of course, and therefore, I think that, as I said, it's the way that the world is moving, and that we should be considering to have this discussion here. Of course, this is not a thing that is going to happen in a short term. It's a long-term discussion, and will require specific analysis to avoid that this sustainability issue can be used illegally by players to practice anti-competitive agreements. And Daniel already said, but just to reinforce this. This is a trend that is already being observed with the greenwashing investigations against Volkswagen, against Deutsche Bank, against Shell. And I believe that CADE here in Brazil, of course, will not accept this kind of antitrust greenwashing here. And Commissioner Sergio gave very interesting guidelines about that.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, that's a great point that you raised, the fact that, I mean, the investment market now, it's pushing that. So everyone's pushing. What do you think, Daniel?
Yeah, all great observations. And I think from a U.S. perspective, maybe, or taking the outside perspective, I still have a few Dutch fibers in me, having been born and raised there. To the U.S., I could see foreign jurisdictions thinking, especially ones that are forward-thinking and trying to figure out solutions to combat, balancing antitrust considerations against ESG considerations as an antitrust agency. That the U.S. approach is a little rigid, and so, apropos the question, how to ensure that competition policy does not act as a barrier to collaboration intended to bring innovative solutions and improve products and services. I think the U.S. approach is a little bit more purist in some ways. And so certainly the U.S. would say competition policy is definitely not going to get in the way of bringing new and innovative solutions and products to market. But it is going to get in the way of companies collaborating in ways that restrict competition with the justification that it's just to improve the environment. I do think there's going to be some resistance, even with the current very forward-thinking antitrust agencies who are at times seemingly willing to, in the U.S., even to consider things beyond the traditional antitrust considerations. They've pretty clearly said outwardly that they are not considering ESG objectives as ways to counterbalance any competitive agreements, and have also made it very clear, because they were accused of that they are not considering the ESG impact of mergers as part of their merger review. And so I think the U.S. position could be viewed as, indeed, competition policy being a little too rigid and standing in the way of progress on the ESG front. I think I've outlined there are many ways to navigate the U.S. antitrust laws in ways that you make sure that any agreement does not fall in the per se category or could be categorized as such. But it does often mean that you can all get together and just decide we're not going to make this product anymore, or this kind of product, or we're going to all agree that we're going to make more of this product and less of that product, because it can easily get characterized as a restriction of output, which falls in the per se category. So you got to do things more around their codes of conduct, standardization that are not or joint ventures that develop new products or source, and I think that's the way to try to navigate and make sure that competition policy doesn't get in the way. Or, and maybe this was Chair Khan signaling by saying there is no ESG exemption, maybe petition the government to create an ESG exemption, right? And that's, I think, will be often the message in the US. This is a market externality, if anything, and those sort of problems are traditionally solved by legislators, not competitors getting together. But I think there are, ways. There's in the US there was, and this is again looking far into the past, but the DOJ again reviewed a business collaboration in 2000 around Alaskan pollock fishermen. But that was a very regulated industry where the government had already, passed legislation that said the entire group of these fishermen cannot fish more than X quota. And then the DOJ said, well, you all agreeing within that quota that applies to this little group, who gets what within the quota, I guess is not incrementally much worse. So we'll let it go. And that was effectively also effectively allocating who gets how much of what. So it seems like something that could be characterized per se, but there the regulatory framework was already so stringent and already restricted output by itself that I think there may be scenarios in which you have heavy government intervention already, where you maybe can even get the US government to sign off on something. But I'm skeptical. This was a long time ago, and I was surprised to see that business review letter, to be honest, even in that heavily regulated framework. So I think the US, from the outside perspective, might be getting in the way a little bit with their competition policy. I don't think they're going to be leading on this anytime soon, like the Dutch Competition Authority is.
Thank you very much. We have a few minutes left. I'd like to open to the public if anyone would like to raise a question. Professor Farina.
Posso falar em português? Posso. Nossa, muito obrigada ao painel pelas aulas que nos deram aqui, colocando de uma maneira muito clara dois problemas muito urgentes e com necessidade de maiores esclarecimentos. Mas a pergunta que eu queria fazer é em relação aos objetivos de cada uma dessas intervenções, protegendo concorrência de um lado e viabilizando sustentabilidade ambiental, social e de governança para a sociedade como um todo. São problemas de natureza diferentes que o mercado só competindo não vai responder, porque nós recebemos sinais equivocados do mercado por conta das externalidades. Eu fiquei até surpresa de não ouvir mais sobre como é que eu enfrento externalidades ambientais que pode nos levar em 2050, se a gente ultrapassar um aquecimento de 1,5 graus, pode nos levar a não ter nem mercados nem pessoas, né? E parece meio, às vezes, catastrófico, não é? Você falar sobre isso, mas a gente tem que perceber que os remédios para você reduzir concorrência ou para você estimular a cultura da concorrência e deixá-la clara, né? Eles não são suficientes para você ter respondido à questão da ação coletiva para enfrentar externalidades. Eu acho que nós estamos falando, sim, de ações coletivas, ações individuais, o que é política pública e o que é estratégia competitiva das empresas. Então, eu acho que eu queria ouvir um pouquinho de vocês essa relação de comportamento coletivo. Questão climática não é solucionada ou dificilmente ela será solucionada por esses acordos, né? Então, nós temos que ter política pública também para o clima. Não vai ser acordo privado que vai resolver esse problema, né? E a discussão com o mercado financeiro no Brasil, acho que abriu uma porta importante para a gente avançar. Existe também um lugar especial para o trade, quer dizer, nós estamos falando de concorrência em mercados relevantes, mas a gente sabe que as questões de padrão, elas são muito facilmente transformadas em barreiras comerciais no mercado internacional. Então, nós temos algumas coisas aqui que são problemas que só o mercado não soluciona, só o privado, acordos privados não solucionam, então que eu tenho que ter uma combinação de política pública, estratégia competitiva e, claro, impedir o greenwashing, e isso é uma coisa interessante, porque vocês trouxeram um conceito de greenwashing que é diferente do que a população de gestão de clima trazem. Quer dizer, ela é um pouco diferente. Tá? Obrigada.
Maria Cecilia would like to address.
Vou responder em português, tá? Beth, eu concordo com você, e eu acho, o que eu entendo desse tema? Tem o lado, sim, macro, que é da política pública, mas isso já é uma forma, pelo menos esse debate que a gente está vendo acontecer no mundo, e, enfim, a gente tem hoje comunicações da OCDE, da ICN em relação a esse tipo de acordo, é o passo que está sendo dado no privado. Então, são complementares, mas eu concordo, assim, 100% que a gente não pode ficar só esperando que esses acordos resolvam todos os problemas. A gente tem que trabalhar também nas ações coletivas, como você colocou. E somente para complementar essa questão do mercado financeiro, sim, eu acho, assim, eu tenho acompanhado muito de perto investimentos, a gente tem agora debêntures incentivadas, etc. A gente está vendo uma demanda enorme por due diligence a respeito do tema, políticas e etc., das 3 letras, mas vamos focar aqui no S, o S também é o S de sustentabilidade, não de social, mas é um passo, eu acho, sabe? Senão a gente estaria estagnado lá atrás e as coisas não iriam andar. Eu acho que um pouco disso, tá?
Obrigada. Pode adicionar, tem alguns minutos.
Muito obrigado. Professora Elizabeth Farina, foi um privilégio ouvir a sua intervenção, obrigado por ela, e também pela oportunidade de estender um pouco mais essa conversa, e como aqui a parte do poder público, eu me senti muito motivado a tecer alguns comentários, e essa sua intervenção demonstra uma compreensão ampla em diversas esferas acerca dos problemas de sustentabilidade, que são um desafio global, como muito bem colocado aqui pelo Michael. E como já foi dito também pela Maria Cecília, especificamente, quando nós estamos tratando aqui da parte do CAD, sobre como essas externalidades positivas podem ser compreendidas como eficiências de um acordo entre concorrentes, e, portanto, aceitas sob a ótica da antitrust, nós estamos falando em alinhamentos de incentivos que a autoridade concorrencial dá aos agentes privados. E tivemos aqui um debate muito sincero e muito responsável por parte tanto de quem está atualmente no setor público, como quem também está no setor privado, dizendo que a transparência tem que ser também por parte das empresas, perante a sua atuação, perante a autoridade, e que a autoridade tem que estar aberta a incorporar esses benefícios que, às vezes, superam a utilidade acrescentada como eficiência ao uso individual de um produto, desde que isso possa ser mensurado, desde que isso possa ser demonstrado, como sendo também uma eficiência própria desse acordo. Porém, isto é apenas uma parte de todo o cenário. Existe também o papel dos tratados internacionais, os quais os países são signatários, e que devem, portanto, agir com seus diferentes órgãos e dar também normas que sejam mais do que meros alinhamentos dentro de uma lei, que é a lei concorrencial, mas que sejam obrigações também para o atingimento de metas. E o direito concorrencial, e assim também as empresas, na parte que lhes cabe, devem ter essa interação de tal forma que, dentro deste pedaço para concorrencial, não haja um conflito entre a lei concorrencial. E eu entendo que o ordenamento jurídico, aqui é a minha opinião pessoal, brasileiro, é constitucionalmente bastante moderno e permeável, de tal forma que seja possível recalibrar um conceito de bem-estar do consumidor, em que se incorporem essas externalidades positivas, inclusive medindo, por exemplo, o ability to pay, se você realmente valoriza um produto sustentável como sendo algo valoroso, mas isso é apenas uma gota no oceano. Existem várias outras políticas públicas que não estão a cabo só da autoridade concorrencial, que devem conversar e coordenar para resolver este problema que terá que ser enfrentado e resolvido.
Obrigada, Sérgio. O tema é tão apaixonante que acabou aqui o nosso tempo e está todo mundo sentado. Eu agradeço a todos que estão aqui hoje conosco e também por todos os nossos panelistas aqui. Agradeço de novo a Maíra e o Ricardo que nos ajudaram, e a Dora, que eu não tinha mencionado também no início, que ajudou super nessa logística e todo o grupo do IBRAC. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Daniel. Obrigada a todo mundo.
Obrigado, thank you.
Thank you.